Hello and welcome back to the STEM Playlist Crusade. This video will be a review of the beautiful surprise announcement release from Warner Archive, which is a film long undervalued and a title that I know myself and a lot of others hoped for and wished for on Blu-ray, but we knew it would be very difficult because this film has had a number of element problems and didn't have the greatest distribution on DVD anyway. But it's a welcome surprise. I'm so happy that we finally have Fritz Lang's first American film, the 1936 MGM picture Fury, on Blu-ray, featuring one of Spencer Tracy's most famous performances at this point in his career. And even though he gets the most focus, and deservedly so, it's really a bit of a two-hander of a picture between him and the great Sylvia Sidney. They both have real powerhouse performances in this scathing, brutal indictment of what mob violence becomes in an actual lynching case. And this is, as said by Peter Bogdanovich in the commentary many times, and by most people who've ever covered this film, it's about the most atypical MGM film you would ever see in your life. I mean, just think about it for a minute. This is Spencer Tracy practically being lynched by a lynch mob, and it's only a miracle he survives. An innocent man who then, in the process of surviving, with everyone in the world believing him dead, decides he's going to wreak his vengeance on those responsible and essentially allow them to be hopefully left to their fate in the judicial system and executed for their crimes. And he basically has a complete mental and psychotic break. And it's a remarkable performance. It's, of course, really two performances in one. But just a couple years after this, you have Spencer Tracy in his Oscar-winning role in Boys Town, a complete turnaround you could have for one actor in terms of not just the character being portrayed, but the actual tone of the film itself. And of course, you could go on to many other films of similar style after Boys Town as well. But just looking at the difference between the two films, you can obviously tell this has the hallmarks of Fritz Lang all over it, right down to many little bits and elements almost seeming maybe not directly inspired, but definitely has the flavor of his 1931 German masterpiece M, his first sound picture. And some people still consider M his best film, with Fritz Lang, he has so many great films and so many films that have greatness and are underrated, like Fury. It's hard to nail it down to just one, but of course Metropolis and M would, either one would have somebody in the history books, but to have two and to have many great American films and many great genre films that are underrated, again, like Fury, that makes this film all the more important. Again, it is an absolute masterpiece of a film. It is a must-see film. I'm not sugarcoating it. I'm not overselling it. It is that good. It is absolutely scathing. It's amazing it was made in 1936, and Fritz Lang had come over to the U.S. like most of the European emigres running from Hitler and the Nazis, and of course the famous story of Goebbels himself offering Fritz Lang control of the German film industry under the Nazi regime, and Lang essentially, getting the heck out of town, lickety-split afterwards. Of course, Lang winds up in Hollywood, one of the great filmmakers of the world, and had to basically start at rock bottom, as everybody else did. But at least Lang had the calling cards of Metropolis and M and his great German successes, but that didn't get him much of anywhere until it really took about a year and Lang's own story to actually get a movie off the ground at MGM. And of course, the idea that Fritz Lang wound up at MGM, the more stars than there are in the Heavens studios that made films about rich and fantastic people and things as far away from the realities of the 1930 Depression, the real life of the 30s as they could possibly get. Well, the idea of the person probably the most anti-family film name you could possibly think of winding up at MGM making films is just really astounding. And of course, Fury is the great outlier because they were not able to dilute the Fritz Lang realism or internal darkness, if you want to label it that. It does, admittedly, when you get to the very end of the film, the actual ending of the film, well, maybe the first time you see it, it might feel a little bit jarring. It does make sense, but it is soft-pedaled a bit, and that's something that when you see the film more and more, you can definitely feel that there's something not quite right there. And actually, when you watch it closely, you can tell that when Spencer Tracy is giving his final speech, there's literally an actual cut within the scene, and you suddenly notice, if you're looking carefully, that it's Spencer Tracy obviously a little bit later in front of a process screen where they've carefully, laid out probably a blow-up still of the set that was originally behind him, and just projected it and had him come in and say a new speech. And that's the soft pedaling there. And it's actually Glenn Erickson who did research based on other people's research as well. But in his recent Cine Savant article, also on this Blu-ray release, he went over the exact details. And what it is the actual speech was rewritten and basically softened and toned down a bit. And there are some 1930s film cliches, if you want to put it that way, in terms of story structure and the final denouement and things like that Lang hated and didn't want. But of course, he was making a movie at MGM where he didn't have all the things that he had at the German UFA studios. And like all the other emigres, it didn't matter how legendary or great they already were in their time. Once everybody was running from Hitler, they got here in Hollywood and essentially were kicked severely down the rung of the film ladder and had to climb their way up. Some, were kicked all the way off and never made it. Some never achieved the success or the career heights that they had before. And Lang is somewhere around there, because after Fury, which MGM apparently hated and tried to kind of bury and not talk about, even though critics saw it and thought it was absolutely a knockout, which it is, of course, because you can't see this picture and say it's not like, getting hit with a bolt of lightning or something, because it does not. There are no punches pulled until like maybe the last, again, the final speech that Tracy has in the film, the very last scene. You get that sense of that punch to the viewer being pulled, just definitely. It is pulled. It is soft pedaled, but again, it doesn't ruin the film, because it was just a rewritten version of the same speech, but it is definitely softened. You can feel that intrinsically. But this film does not hold back anywhere else, and in particular in the frenzy of the small town, when it builds to the actual lynching, where they literally not only attack and overwhelm the small sheriff force at the courthouse, but when they actually take anything they can get their hands on and burn the courthouse down, with Tracy's character still inside, an innocent man held simply for trying to establish his identity, but the actual rumor mill has spread to the fever pitch that there is an actual lynch mob that forms. But it is all photographed in a very they have news or cameramen photographing the scene, but they use that sort of docudrama style as if you are watching what would have been shot by a newsreel team. It has elements of Fritz Lang's style from his earlier films, and it most comes to the fore in that particular scene. And what's also most notable is the film is also quite a bit of a courtroom drama, because the actual courtroom scenes and explaining and arguing the back and forth of the legality and the fact that the prosecution is charging 22 residents of a small town that is everyone has their keeping their lips completely buttoned as to not implicate themselves or the entire freaking town for literally burning a poor man to death, or so they think, of course. It is also an interesting courtroom drama in that case, and you get the back and forth and the moralities, and all the while we, the audience, know that Tracy's character is still alive and is completely unhinged at this point. All his ideals of right and wrong and virtue being so blatantly taken and ripped out of his soul and thrust in his face and set on fire. And to top all of this off, he winds up losing his beloved dog in the middle of this raging inferno. So if you thought John Wick got mad when they killed his dog, well, you haven't seen what happens when Spencer Tracy has his dog killed. So and what's also really amazing when you go back to the film, the second time especially, the whole opening act of the film is setting up the relationship between the Spencer Tracy and Sylvia Cindy characters, and they are so earnestly believable and likable and down to earth and so completely endearing in a very sort of lived-in scenario. Tracy's character rips his coat while he's taking Sydney's character to the train station, so she can go and go to another town and get a job, and so they can save enough money to get married, because it was the middle of the Depression and all. But he rips his coat, and in the train station, she insists on sitting down and digging out her needle and thread and literally sewing it back together right there. And of course, that becomes an important plot point later on, as does a lot of their interactions. So it's really nice that this is set up early on and starts to humanize these characters right in the beginning, but then it comes into play by the third act. So everything is important, and it's always cyclical. But a character's doing that in an MGM film. That just didn't happen, because it's usually, rich society characters. So right there in the opening 5 minutes, this is not your typical MGM film. But you can tell, especially the second viewing and each successive viewing, that the prevailing sense of doom is hanging over their heads. So you feel completely for these characters in the opening act, but something bad is lurking around the corner. It's so oppressively staged and shot, and so much so that you get this sense constantly that there is death or doom or something just hanging right above them. But of course, the first time you see the picture, you don't know all of the story hook, and you just think, oh, it's because the Depression was tough for everyone. So it's very interesting that this is perfectly set up in the beginning. I think that's something Lang was really after. Of course, had he had his way, the film would have been much darker, even darker than it is, because it is extremely dark. But he thought it would be a much stronger statement to have the lead character actually perhaps be guilty himself, and so then you really make it into a moral story. And then he also thought it would be a stronger story, perhaps, if the person in question, whether he was innocent or guilty, but he thought it would have been a much stronger statement had that character actually been black, and you could have made it into a story of race relations. Well, there's no way in hell MGM would have done that in 1936 either way, so we're lucky we got the film at all. Apparently, it was Norman Krasno who came up with the original concept. I think it's supposedly a 4-page draft idea based around real events of a real lynching case, and then it was developed into a screenplay, and Lang himself does get a screenwriting credit. And in that year process, Lang said that while he, instead of just sitting around at MGM, he wanted to really get a sense of America, the country, the idioms, the slang, how the working man talked. And so he apparently drove around as much as he could all through America while he didn't have anything to do. So he taught himself English, and he learned to immerse himself in the American era of the 30s, literally the spirit and soul of the country itself. This is what the smartest directors, writers, actors, artists in general were doing all at the same time. And I think it's interesting to note that the ones who had the longest lasting career once they got to the States are the ones who tried most to integrate themselves into the American world in terms of the society, the American language. I know, of course, it's English, but learning American slang, learning the ins and outs of day-to-day life, not just in the big city, but everywhere. And of course, I think the greatest champion, or I guess I'd say the greatest example of this would be Billy Wilder, who became so naturally Americanized that unless you heard him talking in German, which he rarely did, you would think that he was just a complete New Yorker his whole life. But Lang did this, and I think it influenced not just Fury, but pretty much all of his American films from then onward. And he gravitated towards crime thrillers and crime dramas. So I think he got pigeonholed here in the U.S. by the studio system as being, literally just the guy who makes crime films and genre films. And it would only be some people who would flash back and remember things like his German classics of Metropolis and M. And over time, that got more and more subsided till you get to the 40s and 50s when he was doing films like I Have Behind Me, Hangmen Also Die, and what is probably, I toss up. I can't decide what my favorite Lang American film is, but it's either Fury or his classic The Big Heat, which is one of the great film noirs and one of the most scathing of all. I also like to mention Billy Wilder because parts of Fury and its unflinching criticism of the American small town and how even the people with the best intentions can get whipped into a fury, and these things really do happen. When you see it, you can't, at least I can't help but think of other films, particularly the Billy Wilder masterpiece Ace in the Hole from 1951, and how you have the small town there literally build the big carnival around the poor Leo Minosa stuck in the mine, and his entire plight becomes a hot news item courtesy of Kirk Douglas's Chuck Tatum, the former big city newspaper reporter looking to make it back to the big times. So I couldn't help this with this rewatching, particularly in the courthouse scene when the entire town gets together and it just boils over, and you see just the complete like zany happiness on these people's faces as they're so carried away. I couldn't help but think of Ace in the Hole, and of course the real life, real world society parallels are still with us today. This is a film that has not dated at all, and most shocking of all, this was made at MGM in 1936. As I mentioned before, Spencer Tracy gets to essentially play a dual role. In the first section of the film, he's an extremely likable, down-to-earth, solid man, the type of man that you would respect and admire, and you do. And then seeing the switch when he does survive the courthouse fire, when he first appears, it's a completely different person. It's a absolutely incredible performance. And you can't help but think of his turn in the 1941 Victor Fleming MGM version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is apparently something Tracy was wanting to do. So I think maybe this gave him the first sort of shot at that type of two sides of the same character, that dual role. But I don't know. I can't help but think in the great what ifs, being a big Batman fan, and just the idea of if there had been a great serious A film, or even a good like high tier B film adaptation of Batman comics in the golden age of Hollywood, I can't help but think after seeing Fury again, Spencer Tracy could have made one hell of a Harvey Two-Face. I mean, that just, when you see this, at least I can't help but think, if you try to picture, who could have played the Batman villains in, say, the 40s and 50s. But with Fury and the 41 Jekyll and Hyde, I think Spencer Tracy could have been an incredible Two-Face. But of course, back then, comics were not viewed seriously at all, and trying to get even anyone to approve making a film serial based around comics, unless it was Republic making The Adventures of Captain Marvel, or Universal making the Flash Gordon serials, even serials themselves were looked down upon. But in that nice little niche of the what if, what if there had been a late, even early 40s or late 40s Batman adaptation that was, relatively serious, like the first year or two of Batman comics in 1939, drawing, obviously heavily on the shadow pulp stories and Doc Savage and the much harder characters from the pulp magazines that inspired Batman and Superman and everybody else. I can't help but think how great Spencer Tracy would have been as Two-Face, with maybe, say, Boris Karloff doing the Joker. So anyway, that's just something that occurred to me this rewatch of Fury, which admittedly it had been quite a little while since I'd seen it. Previously, before this Blu-ray, Warner did do a DVD, which was in the controversial Classics box set, which they got together several titles like this of extremely important films that are all about particular topics. They were extremely strong stuff for their time. Unfortunately, that set went out of print very, very quickly, but it did include another of the all-time masterpieces from the 30s, which is another title that I am like, fingers crossed, please do Warner Archive, which is, of course, 1932's I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which, like Fury, is one of the absolute great films. But that went out of print, so I never owned the DVD. I did rent it a number of times. But, of course, being the geek that I am, I did finally just before the Blu-ray, I get the Laserdisc edition, which is bundled here with the old Spencer Tracy Legacy documentary that Katharine Hepburn hosts, narrates, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, I had gotten this finally, and I'd always wanted to see what the Laserdisc looked like. And then, of course, they announced the Blu-ray, so I held off until I could watch the Blu-ray. And then, I like to compare and contrast, which you're probably already well aware of if you've actually watched a video on this channel before. But so this ports over the commentary from the DVD, which is a really nice track that Peter Bogdanovich did. And he actually includes excerpts from interviews he did with Fritz Lang. He tracked him down and did a number of interviews with him. Got to be relatively friendly with him around the time of 1965, I think he says. So I really enjoy getting his insights on Lang as a person, particularly much later in his life after his Hollywood career had pretty much kind of fizzled out by that point. But he also had real personal insights. Eventually, he and Lang kind of had a falling out. And so I found it really interesting hearing his own perspective on the man himself and what he knew of him, his own personal experiences. And of course, getting to hear the excerpts and hear Lang speak in his own voice and his advanced years and everything is just, worth the listen alone. Bogdanovich does have good insights on the film. He's not as big of a fan of it as I am, but it's still a great track, and I'm very glad that was carried over. They did include the trailer, which very nicely is presented in HD, so it's a new trailer scan. Very rarely does that happen, so I always find it a treat when you get the trailer, especially for a film of this vintage, which of course most trailers of films from the 30s are long gone, or you get a reissue trailer that's got a different logo on it and it's like cut down, or it's a 90-second trailer from who knows when in terrible quality. So that was a nice touch. The soundtrack is of course mono. It's losslessly presented in DTS HDMA, and that's it in terms of extras. I do like the new style that most Warner Archive rear covers are using. So usually you have a nice bold color on top. I believe that's the same text as the DVD. As you can see here, the blurb from Hallowell's Film Guide proclaiming this as Lang's best American film, which it's right up there. Like I said before, I flip between this and The Big Heat, but of course both are masterpieces. I don't think it's a stretch to call, Lang is obviously one of the great directors. He's not talked about enough, but and he definitely wasn't the easiest person in the world to work with. Spencer Tracy in particular on Fury hated working with Lang and swore never to work with him again. Henry Fonda did the same thing on You Only Live Once, and I think he did one other picture with him, and then he's like, okay, enough is enough. But Lang was always after something, and of course he had been, kind of top dog in Germany and came over to the States. And there was a story, and it was also repeated in many different books. But, Lang says he was unaware of the American requirement for a lunch break, thinking that everybody could take a working break like him. And then Tracy finally got to the point where he just purposely smears his makeup so that way they would have to redo it. And so that way Tracy literally calls lunch himself for the entire crew. But again, Lang said he was simply not aware of that. It's up to you to decide if he was just playing a sort of power game for better performances or something. But again, Lang was not the easiest director to work with and could be very driven, like, say, a Michael Curtiz, but also, on the other hand, could be very intelligent and very understanding in different ways. So there was an interesting sort of give and take. Bogdanovich says that he got the sense that Lang liked to, I guess, for lack of a better term, sort of mess with people, sort of get people into conflict and see what that would pull out. And I do think that's an interesting part of Lang films. That even goes back to M, because apparently, if you read the great biography of Peter Lorre called The Lost One, which is essential if you haven't read it, when you get to the section on M and the stuff that Peter had to go through in terms of the workload he was under, I think he was also doing a play at the time, and Lang kept him on the set all the time, and almost in a way sort of trying to keep him in character, I guess. And by the time the film ended, Peter Lorre wanted to literally murder Fritz Lang. So I think a lot of people had the same feeling. I'm pretty sure Spencer Tracy did as well, at least by the time the film ended. And then MGM not having a lot of confidence in it, and it being sort of the anti-MGM film, they didn't want anything to do with it, and Tracy kind of never talked about it very much. But it's a real shame, because he gives a phenomenal performance. He's matched by Sylvia Sidman Sydney, and I think Lang really got incredible performances out of them. So the disc itself carries the same art, and it's just the standard Warner Archive, no fancy swag, no slipcover or anything, but I'm totally fine with that. It keeps the price down. We get lovely art. And I don't know how they did it, but the picture transfer on this thing is sensational. Again, this film has had element problems. The DVD was okay, not the greatest in terms of the damage baked into the source and everything. So you could tell they'd had to do work even at that time. This is apparently a brand new scan. It definitely looks like it. I don't know what sorcery they did. This is stunning. And it's also nice to see a sort of hands-off approach in terms of not being too overzealous in the cleanup and things. It's mastered at the usual lovely high Warner Archive bitrate. It is absolutely stunning looking, and I even noticed there's one shot, which I'll include a screen grab of, that you can see a tiny little bit of dirt poking in through the bottom of the frame, which shows that this was not obviously, noise reduced to death and everything. It is a very wonderful archival-minded presentation, as all discs really should be. So in terms of the picture, it's an absolute must-own, top rating. I don't know how they got this looking this good. It looks stunning. The audio side is where I have a little bit of a quibble, and this is something most people are obviously not going to notice or get into, but since I also dabble in the audiophile realm, and I'm also the person who will not just compare different pressings of an album looking for the best mastering, I also like to compare old video releases, which can be very revealing in terms of the audio content. So, of course, the film is mono, and it's always been very noisy on disc. The old DVD was very noisy and seemingly had some noise reduction applied here and there. The Blu-ray seems to advance that even a little bit further. So when you watch this, you will notice the track is very noisy. They obviously had to work with what they had. There are one or two spots, at least I counted one or two, there may have been two or three, where there is a little bit of volume fluctuation. There's not really a lot of pops or anything, but there is a constant, hiss inherent, which is fine. It's supposed to be there. So don't come into this thinking that it's going to be a beautiful, clean track, because, of course, it is a 1936 film, and they have to work with what they have. However, if you happen to have a working player, and if you happen to have a copy of the film on Laserdisc, this is the MGM release, which I know it's early 90s, but just to double check, let's see, 1993. So if you have this, it of course carries a PCM digital mono track. Now, as I said before, both the DVD and the Blu-ray, again, I don't own the DVD, but I was able to confirm with others who do, those do obviously have some noise reduction going on. This doesn't really have any, so it obviously means it's going to be noisier, but at the same time, because it doesn't have a lot of heavy-handed noise reduction, if you were to put them side by side, you will notice there is some more high-end frequency information in here. You get a little bit more in terms of detail in the dialogue and the music and things, but it is significantly noisier. So I know if you were going for pure audio fidelity, I do think the Laserdisc is actually quite a bit better because it doesn't have the same heavy-handed application. But again, I understand why they did it, and I know a lot of people will not be able to really live with a track that's this noisy. I myself am the type of person who, if I can see a print of a film at an art house or a revival screening, if there's a little tag when you get to the theater and it says this print is in really bad shape, I kind of get the little perverse jump for joy inside, because sometimes I like seeing things a bit beat up, or I don't mind if a vintage film print has a really scratchy or noisy mono track, because that's just how it was. However, it's not like Noise City, like it's overwhelming the presentation, but it's a lot of inherent noise, and it seems to be the same source track that was used for the DVD and the Blu-ray. So if you go all the way back to the Laserdisc, you will find a track that obviously is nowhere near as clean and easy to experience, but I do think it has significant increases in audio fidelity. So I do actually have to give the nod to the Laserdisc track because of that. But again, I know most people are not going to go this far, But if you do have both, you can make that comparison. And actually, our good friends at the Bad Audio on Blu-ray blog have made a comparison video, which I will link in the description. So you can actually head over there, and they've got some pictures of the waveforms and spectrographs, and a little comparison clip flipping between the Laserdisc and the Blu-ray. So you can actually hear the difference for yourself and determine, if that's going to be an issue for you. Again, noise reduction is something that you're going to have to use at some point, but the trouble is when you start losing detail and what's the balance, how far do you go with your toolkit in terms of cleanup before you start maybe making some trade-offs and losing information. In a perfect world, what I hope could happen in the future would be to have both. So there's plenty of space still on a Blu-ray disc. So I would hope that maybe we could get, say, an unrestored per se and a restored track option. That would just be if it were me doing it, that's what I would try and do. That way you give the presentation to each part of the audience, and you have the fully archival sound, and you have the cleaned up version. But that would just be my own 2 cents. That's the only real detraction in this release. Still, ultimately, for the greatness of the film, its importance, and the picture transfer, plus the great Peter Bogdanovich commentary, this is a must-own. It's one of the best Warner Archive discs of the year, one of the most important Blu-ray releases of the year, catalog or new. This is one of the great American films. It is arguably Lang's best American film. So I wish that there was an option to have a track as non-messed with as the Laserdisc on here. So again, in my own perfect world, this would have the option of having the warts and all Laserdisc type audio and the hyper, it's not hyper cleaned up, but the much more cleaned up presentation. Again, it's not going to be something you notice unless you're able to literally flip back and forth between the two. Of course, obviously, the Laserdisc has much lesser picture, seeing it's a 1993 disc. It has some edge enhancement and ringing and stuff that you could get in LDs. But it's still a fine disc for the time. But it was a real surprise to find that the Laserdisc has a stronger audio track, because again, this film's always had element problems. Again, I'm pretty sure MGM did try to bury it, and they were not fond of this. It's not like it got reissued a whole lot. And again, it's an amazing surprise that MGM made Fury. And so I'm just amazed that they did. I'm so pleased that they did. Even if, if Lang had been doing it himself, especially in Germany, it would have been, to say that Fury would have been a darker film had Fritz Lang made it in Germany before the rise of Hitler, that's an understatement. Had Lang made it at another studio instead of MGM, it probably would have been a little bit darker. Say he had made it at RKO, especially if he had made it at Warner Brothers, because it very much feels like a Warner Brothers film. And I'm not the first person to say or think that. You watch this, and if it didn't have the MGM lion on it, you would think it's a Warner Brothers film. But it's amazing we have this at all, and especially in this beautiful new Warner Archive Blu-ray package. Again, this is a title many of us wished for, hoped for on Blu-ray. I'm sure if you know this film, you've already purchased this release. So definitely leave your comments below with your thoughts on Fury, Fritz Lang, the new Warner Archive Blu-ray, and of course, if you want to talk about the audio, I'm always happy to do that. Again, I just recently got this in the past year, and I held off watching it until I got the Blu-ray, because that was announced like literally right after I got this, so it was like fortuitous timing. But I didn't expect the old LD to have that much of a noticeable difference that you could literally hear, because I literally just put these on and I just A/B back and forth between them for a few minutes. Usually I like to spot check the old release once I watch the new one, and so I was doing that, and I'm like, hey, wait a minute, there's quite a bit of difference here. So I can understand why it happened, but it is a little unfortunate. It's the one thing that kind of mars this release, which is otherwise absolutely perfect. Again, the picture is stunning and is right up there with the usual amazing Warner Archive standard. And they have been dropping releases right and left, and you just can't even keep up, especially my wallet can't, that's for sure. So that is the new release of Fury. And I know I name-dropped the Peter Lorre biography, but I would also like to mention I don't have a copy. I read it in the library, but I really want to get a physical copy. If you want to know more about Spencer Tracy, the great biographer James Curtis wrote an amazing Tracy biography. I think it's the definitive book on Spencer Tracy. It is quite long, and he is a very complicated individual, so the length is worth it. But I think he did an incredible job, so I highly recommend that. And there's a great section about Fury in there that explains a lot of the back and forth that Tracy had and his distaste, shall we say, for Fritz Lang's working methods. And more on Lang, I do have a copy of this. It's been a while since I read it, and I do really want to do a reread. But one of my favorite biographers, again, like James Curtis, is Patrick McGilligan, who wrote probably the best book on Hitchcock overall. But he wrote a great book on Lang with a great title, The Nature of the Beast. This is a later updated paperback printing, but you can get this relatively inexpensive. And this is a fantastic book. So if you want to read more about Lang, and of course there's a good section in this book on Fury as well, this is the book you want to check out, which is Patrick McGilligan's The Nature of the Beast. Lang is a extremely interesting character. And again, because you hear so many horror stories, you think of him as cold and distant and not very good with actors and carrying a chip on his shoulder for coming away from Germany and basically having to start over, which pretty much anybody naturally would have had. But like Tracy, he's a far more complex individual than most of the anecdotes and stories would have you believe. And I think Peter Bogdanovich's commentary, where he talks about actually getting to know Lang and kind of becoming friendly with him for a bit in the 1960s outside of just doing the interviews, I think that also speaks volumes in terms of Lang being a much more complex individual. So I do highly recommend McGilligan's book on Lang. So in short, if you've never seen this film, I hope I've done a decent enough job at trying to sell it to you. I do think this is one of the truly important films of the 30s, one of the great films, one of Lang's best films, arguably his best American film, a film so completely earning its title of Fury. It's one of Spencer Tracy's best performances. It's one of Sylvia Sidney's best performances. It is filled with a whole roster of character actors that you will recognize, some before they were famous, because you even have Walter Brennan popping up here, Bruce Cabot as well, so many familiar faces, and it's really striking seeing them in a real indictment of American society at the time. And it hasn't lost any of that power to startle and really strike home, because we still have a lot of these issues floating around now. So I don't just recommend this film. This is a must-see masterpiece of the medium, even if it is soft pedaling right there at the end a little bit, because of course it was made at MGM and it was made in the production code. But you still get Fritz Lang through and through 100%. There are many little bits and sequences that feel very much reminiscent of M. Particularly, there's a scene towards the end where Tracy's character is walking around and he feels like he's being haunted and followed by the spirits of the 22 that he has condemned to their possible death in the court judicial system. And that feels very much out of M, the scenes with Peter Lorre walking around when he's actually marked. So, again, if you've never seen this film, please do yourself a favor and check out the Warner Archive release and then listen to the great Peter Bogdanovich commentary. It is beyond well worth your time. And interestingly enough, maybe because I have a very warped sense of messing with traditions and things, this kind of makes an interesting holiday film too. It's definitely on the dark side, but it does make you grateful for some things and make you question some things, which I like having a bit more challenging material around the end of the year instead of just going into the much more warm and friendly usual holiday fare. So instead of just having an action movie for Christmas, maybe try something with a definitely much more bite to it here and there. And Fury makes a great example, and perfect that it was released this time of the year. So that is the Warner Archive Blu-ray release of Fury. I want to thank you ever so much for watching. Hope this has been at least somewhat informative, and hopefully if you've already checked out this disc, you fell in love with the film all over again, as I have, as I do every time I see it. You forget how good this is. You forget how well made and powerful an indictment this is, even though it was made at MGM in 1936. So please do yourself a favor and support the Warner Archive and check out their release of Fritz Lang's masterpiece, Fury, from 1936. And as always, keep physical media alive, keep supporting our boutique labels that are doing really the lion's share of getting classic films in and out there in the world, and new editions and new transfers and things, and really resuscitating great masterpieces like Fury. And as always, thanks ever so much for watching.